Conchita, Ambrosio, and Andy Clark with us today. Conchita is a professor and researcher at the University of Luxembourg, and Andrew is at the Paris School of Economics. Both are experts and leading scholars they're trying to mention a lot of different areas where you have different studies, but including inequality, political preferences, and the consequences of economic insecurity. More recently, Conchita has been working on the transmission of genetic conditions and modifications between mother and children. I remember our funny discussion about the gap between the biological and the actual age in Mexico. But today they will present a paper, or maybe a summary of different papers about the consequences of economic insecurity. We will have 1 hour and a half, including comments and questions. So I think that's all. So only again, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for actually organizing this talk for us, and thank you for being here on Friday before your holiday. And we're going to present a series of papers we're working on related to the effect that economic insecurity has on behavior of people. And please feel free to interrupt us. We want to have questions while we go. So just interrupt us for any doubt or whatever you want to ask. And I'm going to be the first part of the presentation, then I'm going to give the floor to Andrew to talk about the job market. And the first part is a little bit more of a standard approach in measuring economic insecurity from an observer perspective. So we use more what is standard in the income distribution literature, and we are going to propose an index of economic insecurity that is something similar to the Gini coefficient, for those who know the Gini coefficient for the income distribution. And then I'm going to give the floor to Andrew, where he's going to talk about insecurity on the job market, and in particular, he's going to look at the effect of some reforms that took place in some European countries that made one group of workers insecure compared to another group of workers. And we had an excellent discussion earlier with Rosanna and the team, also because we are going to see that we use the standard countries to see what are the consequences of these people of being insecure, but it would be really great to expand the analysis to Latin American countries. And we saw that there are some possibility of looking at that over here. And the reason why we're interested in economic insecurity is because we keep talking about the fact that economic insecurity has risen for many of us in many countries. Okay? And the sort of from a social science perspective, the advantage of looking at economic insecurity is that anybody can be insecure. So we're not talking about poverty, that relates to a small part of the population, but here is about something that can affect everybody. Even rich people can feel economically insecure. And there has been a lot of research on the effect that economic insecurity has on political outcomes. And we have seen in many countries during the past decades or so a shift towards more conservative governments. And for many people, for many researchers, I'm going to show you some of the contributions, there is the feeling that this shift towards more conservative parties is not due to inequality nor to poverty, because inequality has not risen in many countries, even if we see this shift. And the same has happened when we think about income poverty. There has not been an increase so radical to explain this political shift that we observe, that is so important for understanding our lives. So a lot of people thought that actually economic insecurity could be behind the support for populist party, lack of trust towards EU and European institutions, the 2016 US presidential election, and also the UK Brexit referendum, when the UK decided to leave the European Union. And for these papers, for these contributions, what I'm going to show you is that we still do not know what we mean by exactly economic insecurity. So, we have an agreement on what inequality is among social scientists. We have an agreement on what poverty is, even if normal people don't think that this is inequality, this is poverty, but at least from a researcher point of view, we know what we mean by inequality, but from a researcher point of view, we still do not know what we mean by insecurity. So we lack a definition of economic insecurity, and we also lack a measure of economic insecurity. So what they did in these other papers that try to look at economic insecurity and the effect of politics. So the paper is about economic insecurity, but then they measure economic insecurity in several sort of ad hoc ways. For example, it could be the change in unemployment rate, or different variables related to unemployment, living on benefits, the urbanization, or per capita income and unemployment rate, the current unemployment rate, the first principal component of a lot of aspects of individual's life. So different ways of capturing what we could mean is economic insecurity. So if we go around and we look for what people mean by economic insecurity, so we try to build a definition, and then once we have a definition, I'm going to show you the way we propose we could measure economic insecurity. So this is a United Nations definition. They say it's not easy to give a precise definition to the term economic insecurity, partly because it often draws on comparisons with past experiences and practices, and also because security has a large subjective or psychological component linked to the feeling of anxiety and safety. Seen in general terms, economic insecurity arises from the exposure to adverse events and from the inability to cope with and recover from the costly consequences of these events. Okay, so it's something that has to do with the future, your anxiety, your worries about the future, and you fear that you are unable to cope with and to recover from the consequences of this exposure to bad events that may happen. Lars Monnet was one of the first in economics to try to propose measures of economic insecurity, and he thinks that the definition of economic insecurity could be the anxiety produced by the lack of economic safety, that is, by the ability to obtain protection against objectively significant potential economic loss. So in the view of Lars and in their contribution, your economic insecurity if the welfare state doesn't protect you enough for big shocks like unemployment, widowhood, poverty. This is his approach to economic insecurity. So also the Stiglitz Commission and the Commission for the Measurement of Economic Progress, they think that economic insecurity may be defined as uncertainty about the material condition that may prevail in the future. So in this paper on politics, and in another paper, earlier paper, where we propose a measure of economic insecurity, we have this working definition that economic insecurity is the anxiety which arises from the anticipation of adverse events and from the fear and difficulties from recovering from them. So you're here today, you look at the future, and you worry that, again, there could be a shock happening to you, and you're not able to recover from the shock. So this idea of having up and downs in your resources. You lose, and then if you're able to recover, then you're less insecure because you're able to go back up to recover from the adverse consequences of this loss. And so what we do in our paper and the measure that we propose is simply trying to see what has happened to the individual in the past. So the individual doesn't know the future, but you feel, and so the less insecure you feel, because you think that you could also recover if this happens to you in the future. And the other idea that we sort of have is, so we're modeling this use, okay, or reverse use. And then the idea is that you have more memories of what has happened closer to you. So the closer the event, the higher the idea, the bigger your memories are. So the measure we propose is, and then there are others measures in the literature. For example, this is a measure for the United States, is a drop in disposable family income of at least 25%. Another contribution looks at the volatility arising from income, but that is not gains, so you're not insecure because you're going to gain income, but it's because you're going to drop. So it looks at the income dropping below the household overall trend. So this idea that's not risk insecurity, but it's really just this negative part, this drop and recovery from the drops. So we propose an index, and we axiomatically characterize this measure following the tradition of income distribution literature. And then we show that this measure of economic insecurity can explain, correlationally of course, this shift towards more right-wing governance in European countries. We look at Germany, we look at the UK, and we are also able to explain the Brexit referendum. Are there any questions? Yes.
You going over how the Gini petition is related to the
economic insecurity?
Yes.
They're not correlated. And we also try to use different measures of insecurity and look at the correlation of them extremely low. So we still lack an overall measure where we all agree. I think this is a field that has a lot of potentials for contributions.
And out of curiosity, how do you measure data for the security index?
We look at panel data with the idea, one paper we have is built on wealth of the individual over time. And there are very few data sets, even panel data sets, even among the countries that we use, where we have regular panel data on wealth. So we could look at Italy, we could look at the US, PSID. But the contribution I'm going to present looks at panel data on household income. So the German socioeconomic panel, the UK HRS, the British household panel study, and there is data for the US as well. Yes?
So I don't know if you see a connection with here economic literature
Yes.
on model of reference
Yes.
evaluation.
Yes.
I remember that serves as an
Yes.
economic basis.
Yes, so we see the correlation with that. And it sort of follows a little bit of a different approach. This sort of we characterize the measure with looking at axiomatic properties. And then once you understand the properties, then you show that that is the measure, the one you should use. And the key properties are basically two axioms. Okay, so in the quality measurement, the key axiom is the reluctant principle of transfer. Here we have two properties that sort of capture what insecurity is. And then we use a lot of other axioms just to characterize the measure, but they're really just there to give a nice shape. But these are what we really mean by insecurity. So the first property is gain-loss monotonicity. This says that a gain on income from a period to the next is associated with lower insecurity as compared to a situation where there's a change, or a loss in income is associated with higher insecurity compared to a flat period.
Sorry, is there a loss aversion?
We do. You can choose a good loss aversion, and this is what we put in our application because the loss has more weight for you than a gain. So this is how you change, you put relationship between the coefficients on gains and losses. And the second one is what I said, proximity monotonicity. The closer to today, the higher your memory, so the higher the weight you're going to put on what happens to you closer to today. So with this said, we're going to rank these views. And the idea is that the least insecure stream of income is something always going up. The most insecure is somebody always going down. And then these profiles, they are ranked according to higher insecurity level. So this is more insecure than this, than that, than that. And what is this doing? So this is today, and this is the past. So this is somebody who was flat here, then had a gain and had a loss. So it's somebody just coming from a gain but then lost immediately. This is somebody who lost as the same shape, but this happened earlier. This is somebody who was always flat. This is somebody who had a gain, a loss, but recovered immediately earlier. And this is somebody who's just out of, was just able to recover from a loss. So according to the measure that we characterize, we have that this profile is more insecure. So these are ranked according to the level of insecurity. This is the one that has the lowest level of insecurity according to the one we propose. So this is to give you a flavor of what this index is actually doing. And if you look at the formula for this index, this is sort of Gini-like in the sense that it's looking at, Gini is looking at me and you, me and everybody. This is me and myself in the past. And it's just a weighted sum of losses and gains discounted. So you can, this is what we do in application, a loss has a higher weight than a gain. And then we discount, so closer to today, the higher the effect of the measure. And then there are some other axioms that you have there to give the index this shape. So this is what the measure we propose, okay? It's a measure that tries to predict the future from the past, with the idea that if you are more able to recover, the more confident you are that you will be able to recover in the future, so you feel less insecure. So we apply this data to, of course, we try with some values of the parameter. We also do a search to show that if you change the value of the parameters, our application results are not going to be modified. So we do a research of a lot of values of this parameter. And what is our main variable? It's, again, traditional from the income distribution literature. We take household income, we make it equivalent household income. So we're looking at the changes of equivalent household income from one period to the next for each individual. And in this application, we look at over a period of 5 years in the past. So we have yearly information of equivalent household income. And for this data set from Germany, from the UK, but also from the US, there is panel data information at the household level, and there is also information on political outcomes. So I'm not going to go through the exact wording of the questions, because we don't have the time, but what people are asking in this data set is if you think of yourself as a supporter of any political party, okay, so if these are intentions to vote. So if you think that you will support a party or not, and then if you say, yes, I see myself as supporting a party, they ask you which party are you going to support. Okay? And we look at this period for the UK, and then we look at a similar period for Germany. So what are the parties that we are going to rank from the right to the left? We have conservative, liberal, Labour, and other parties, or people that do not have any political preference. And this is household panel data from those periods, so we're not really able to pick the extremes parties like, I don't know, Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, or UKIP, that are big now, but were very little when we are in the period that we are analyzing. And then we have a lot of observation both in the US, in the UK, and in Germany. We look at individuals that are in working wage, 18 and 65, that are not retired, where we can compute will stay conservative at T+1. So the majority of people don't change their political preferences. There are some shifts, but these are not enough to allow us to estimate fixed effect models that we eliminate variation. So in both countries. So the type of very simple regressions that we're going to run is we use the panel data to build the economic insecurity measure, but then we run cross-section analysis looking at support of individual I in a region R and T as a function of large household income, household equivalent income, large economic insecurity that we built looking at the past 5 years, a series of control, and then we have a period dummy and region dummy. And then once we say, so this is for support, and then we look at which party, individual vote. And we had household income and economic insecurity somehow to attenuate endogeneity concerns, but still, as I said, this is just a correlation analysis. And what we find that even if we control for household income, and we also control for a proxy for wealth, which is home ownership, this is the only variable that we have in our data, in addition to income and home ownership, economic insecurity has an additional effect. And very similar in the UK and in Germany. So economic insecurity is bringing people from having no political preferences to have political preferences. And what type of political preferences in both countries? There is a reduction, as we saw before, in having no political preferences, but then what type of political preferences individuals have? In the UK, there is a rise in conservative support for conservative parties, and the same happens also in Germany. There is a rise in support for CDU, CSU for Germany. So economic insecurity, in addition to being rich in terms of income and also in terms of wealth, which is something we already know, also people that are insecure in our application, they have more support for parties, and which parties have support for more conservative parties. Then we did a little bit of heterogeneity analysis. We see that the effect of insecurity on support for conservative parties is larger for those who are married, for those that have children, and is also more pronounced post-2000 than pre-2000 if we split our period in two, but we do not find any differences by income groups, and we also don't find any differences by wealth groups, homeowners or not. Then we turn on to another data. Yes.
What is your interpretation about the risk result? Because, okay, you can say people who experience or feel more economic insecurity support
More conservative.
Yes, why? Because we could expect the opposite.
I agree with you, but there is this idea that probably conservative parties are nowadays more linked to safety and to security.
But I don't think it's the same.
Yeah.
It's, I think in politics, right-wing parties are conservative, but in economics, we used to
I
know
understand.
here that's more,
But
they don't care about income distribution.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, but probably, but probably people don't know. You know, do you think normal people, why are they voting for, if it's not in their interest? You see, it's not in their interest. So why? And we thought, probably it's insecurity that's making that. And this is pure speculation. We don't have any observation on that. So we come up with this measure that is trying to model insecurity and very good to explain something that is not in the interest of the population. Yes, please.
You mentioned Hacker's work before.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, in his work, he interprets much of the rise in economic insecurity or even volatility in the US as a consequence of the liberal politics and the neoconservative revolution and such, right? So in a way you could say those things are connected, but maybe not in a trivial way, right?
Yes. They do that, especially because the project was also funded by the And the measure is specifically for us, yes. But we try to apply that measure also to our data. And then we do what we call it sort of a beauty contest. And our measure is the one that performs the best. So our score is higher when we apply our measure as opposed to the happy measure, the variance in absolute income, the change in income, and the trend growth in income. So we try a few measures. Yes?
Control for age?
I think yes. We control for age, we control for gender, unemployment, what do we control for?
We control for exogenous characteristics, predetermined characteristics, so
Yes.
age,
Gender.
ethnicity, gender. Not sure about how important.
I said,
Tolerance is not important, actually. Yes, not also important as compounded with the change in income over time. Education. I would have thought we'd control for education. I would have thought we did, because that's largely predetermined as an population. And it could compound. Educated people tends to work that way. So tends to work more significantly.
I don't remember. This paper is published, but it took us ages. It took us ages to have it out. And then he sort of, yes. I don't remember the control. We tried so many versions. It took us 3.5 years to publish it before. It was really a long process. Yes. We tried to look at the effect of the incumbent party, and it didn't have any effect. We checked that. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Economic insecurity. So the people change, right, left,
Yes.
and
We
left.
checked, and they didn't have, it didn't play a role in the party that was in power at the time. I remember. Yes.
Economic insecurity is such a big
It is.
Why don't you try to access this through direct?
Because this is what Andrew is going to talk about on the labor market. This is just to show that you can have a measure, like a measure of inequality. This is now a different measure which wants to be a measure of insecurity. And generally, at least here, when you do this kind of correlation analysis, you don't want to run a subjective variable and a subjective variable, because then you'll be driven by another variable that you've not observed. So somehow this is the advantage of having a more objective variable that you run on a subjective variable. In the analysis Andrew is going to show, and I'm going to be quick and give you the floor, is actually using exogenous variation, where you are able to estimate the causal effect without worrying about this influence on variables. Yes. Yeah. Okay. US data is a type of a little bit of a different type of data. It's freely available on collected by the University of Southern California, and it's an internet survey. So respondents can connect anytime they want, and they have different modules. And we use the election poll study that was run between July and November 2016. And here, voters were asked to report the probability of voting in the election, and also of voting for Trump, Clinton, or any other party. And they also have information on income. There is no information on home ownership. So we can build our index leave the EU. And then when we try to see what is the effect of income, wealth, and economic insecurity on the answer to leave the EU, we observe that insecurity favors Brexit. So each individual, in terms of income, in terms of wealth, want to stay in the EU, but insecure individuals, they prefer to leave the EU. And okay, this is correlation. Last thing we do, we did a lot of tests. I told you ages to publish this paper. We tried to do, because this is correlation, we tried to do a value-added model. So we control for the party at T-2, and then we looked at the effect of insecurity and income on voting at time T. And we still have, the effects are reduced because now we control for economic insecurity, for preferences of voting what you did at time T-2. And then we observe again that economic insecurity has a significant effect on
the sign in income changes, right?
Yes, yes. And one criticism could be that these coefficients are small, and they were small also before. But Andrew did a calculation on what they actually mean in terms of shifts of votes, and they are able really to explain the shifts in the winning party of the elections. Now I want to go very quickly because we have a lot of things to say, and we apply this data also to explain health of individuals. We use the Australian data, HILDA, and here is the same index applied to Australian data from 2001 2018. Here we don't look at the past 5 years, but we look at the whole history of household income of individuals, and we show that the economic insecurity is related to worse physical and mental health. So it can explain also, it has also effects on physical and mental health of individuals looking at SF-36 as valuable. I'm going to leave the floor to Olivera because there's a lot to talk about the labor market, and this might be also. Did I get too much time?
Okay, so thank you. I'm a labour economist, and I'm not at all axiomatic. I don't do axioms, I don't do theory, and I don't really understand them either. What I am interested in is what happens to people when they carry out their jobs. What do they think about it? And how, in some sense, how good is it for them to be doing the jobs they do? So their overall quality of work, if you like. So the first thing to say is that work is ubiquitous. Amongst prime age, 25 to 54, and I think that covers everyone in this room. Almost everyone works. So almost all prime age people are active on the labour market. Most of those are in employment. Most of the people who are in employment work full-time. So full-time employees, well, as you can calculate this yourself, spend just under 2,000 hours per year at work. I live in France. France is much less because we have lots of holidays. We're actually never at the office. If you add average commuting time, commuting is a really interesting topic actually. There's much more work on this. On average in Europe, commuting is about 30 minutes. 30 minutes in, 30 minutes out. On average, some countries it's much less. Littler countries tends to be smaller, countries that are more openly centralised tends to be larger. All of that to say, if you add up the time you spend at work and the time you spend going to work and coming back again, you're spending around 7 continuous years of your life between the age of 25 and 54. And that's not including all the time you're going to spend worrying about work. Okay, so for the younger people here, sorry about that. And it really matters whether it's good or not. So what we want to know is actually what makes a job good in some sense. What do workers value in a job? What's important for them? And I think job insecurity is really important. And I'm right. I know that because workers agree with me. These are numbers coming from an international survey called the International Social Survey Programme. It's freely available to be downloaded. The numbers I have here are only OECD countries, but it covers a very wide variety of countries across the world, including Latin America. So that's something we could actually think about in the future. Anyway, back to where I was. If we ask people what's important to you in your job, this is the percentage you say the aspect is very important. The winner is job security. That's ranked number one. It's ranked number one in every year for which I currently have data. The 2025 data is being prepared. And it's as true for women as it is for men. So it's kind of ubiquitous that job security is important. Great. So what do we actually do about that? How can we measure job security? How can we know if people are secure at work or not? Well, one approach, as Conchita said, is to be axiomatic and actually derive indices according to what happens to people and what has happened to them. That's one way to do it, an objective measure, which has the huge advantage of being objective. I'm a kind of subjective person. I think there are subjective measures. So actually asking people simple questions. Are you satisfied with your job security? Are you satisfied with your life? These kind of subjective measures have the advantage that they're democratic. It's not me saying, insecurity is this. I'm just asking you, are you secure? And you'll tell me what you think about that. So that's democratic, it's bottom up as opposed to top down. They're very simple questions, they take 10-15 seconds to answer, and they seemingly are understandable. In the sense, if I ask you, are you secure? Are you satisfied with your job security? Very few people say, I don't understand the question. So non-response to these kinds of satisfaction questions is typically under 1%, as opposed to asking you how much do you earn, where missing values are often 10% more. People will tell you or say they don't know, which is a lie. So, what kind of subjective questions can we use here? A simple question, is your job secure? Or not? And around 3/4 to 70% of workers in OECD countries say their job is secure, which is either a lot or not very much. 2/3 say they're secure, that's great. Also 1/3 say they're not secure, that's sort of bad. But this is one way of measuring security. This is the distribution across countries. I'm not French, but I've been living in France for a very long time. And I'm very, very happy to say that France is not at the bottom of this distribution. Typically, France is at the bottom of almost every distribution subject to evaluations, but here the Czech Republic is even worse. Thank you for doing the checks. That's one way of measuring insecurity. Another is to ask, in some sense, a qualitative or quantitative evaluation of your probability of job loss. So here's a qualitative one. How likely is it you're going to lose your job in the next 2 years? With most people saying it's improbable. Or we can have a quantitative version of this, which is arguably a bit more cognitively demanding. What probability do you have of losing your job in the next 2 years? So it's not qualitative, not much, a lot. It's actually give me a number. And here, the percentage, this is German data over the past 20 years or so. The the average probability is about 20% over a 2-year period. And in a very attractive sense of similarity, the Germans are 20% over 2 years, the Australians with the same question are 10% over 1 year. So either Australia or Germany are very similar countries, or people just don't understand the question, and this is the kind of figure they give in general. So we can ask people, is your job secure? We can ask them, how likely is it you're going to lose your job? Or thirdly, we can ask them some evaluation. How satisfied are you with your job security? This is what we've done in one of the large-scale UK data sets. And if you do that, you get a satisfaction figure that's around 60%. Only about 2/3 of people, less here, are satisfied with their security at work. And that's far larger than the percentage who are satisfied with their age and so on. So all of these are very good. They're all useful and interesting measures. Are they reliable in any sense? I love subjective evaluations, but subjective evaluations are subjective. So you ask me something, and I say, oh yeah, I'm satisfied with 7 out of 10. You ask someone else something, and they say, yeah, I'm satisfied with 6 out of 10. Your 6 may be larger than mine 7. Problem of interpersonal comparability of response scales. So that is a bit of a drag when you're carrying out cross-section analyses of subjective evaluations. We may not be using language in the same way. My personal feeling is that we probably do to a certain extent. There's been some great work on MRI imaging of people's brains when they record different numbers that seems to suggest some kind of monotonic relationship between the strength of neural activity and the number that is given. So anyway, it's in my interest to say that as I work on these variables. So there are issues about response style, omitted variables, and so on, as Conchita said, we always have omitted variables. So ideally, given that it's difficult to measure job insecurity, let's not do it. Let's not measure it at all, but simply infer it from regulatory change that we think should have made some group less protected than another. So in other words, reforms, and particularly as I'm a labour economist, reforms on the labour market. So the ideal thought experiment is I take this room, I randomly assign half of you to one half of it, randomly assign half to the other, I measure something for the 2 groups, then I institute a reform of some kind that affects only the right-hand side of the room, and then I measure the same thing again. Okay? So what I've got then is 2 dimensions. I've got time dimension, pre-post. I've got horizontal dimension, treated control, and all of you have done econometrics 101. This is difference analysis. Pre-post, treated control. What is the difference between the 2? In terms of job insecurity, I want some people to be more protected than others. And I live in France, Conchita is Italian. Our countries are characterized by repeated regulatory change. If something goes wrong, just change the regulations. If it still goes wrong, reform it again. And we just think a lot of reforms in these 2 countries, which, speaking as an applied economist, I think is absolutely brilliant. So, because I get all these exogenous changes in the way the labour market works. And so I'm going to start talking about this reform called the Lugar tax in France. And this, like a lot of reforms, came from very good intentions. Okay? Anyway, the idea is if you're a firm, right, if you're an employer, you lay your workers off. That actually imposes a cost on society. Because the laid-off workers receive benefits. Those benefits are paid for out of general taxation. They're not paid by the firm. So it's a classic externality. It's like the polluter. Okay? The firms are polluting the labour market, if you like. We want to make them pay. The old Pigouvian principle. And that's what the good old tax did. It covers private sector workers with permanent contracts, and if you lay off a private sector worker with a permanent contract, under certain circumstances you need to pay a tax to the government. Okay? So it's taxing pollution is the old idea. This was introduced in the late 1980s, and as you can see, it was reformed, then reformed, then reformed, then reformed again. It actually disappeared in the mid-2000s, but it lived its life. The idea is a simple one. I'm going to tax firms that lay off workers, private sector firms that lay off workers, and in particular, this side of the room, we don't care about you. Okay? You're all young. You don't matter. Some parts of this side of the room, let's not get personal here. If you're aged over 50, you are taxed, or rather your firm is taxed when you lay you off. Why so? This idea that it's more difficult to reallocate older workers. Okay, you people are flexible. So we need to protect me, not you. Okay, this is the idea. So the tax depends on the worker's age. And here in its initial version, it was age 55 onwards. If you lay me off, I'm 55, more or less. You have to pay the social security system 3 months of my gross wage. Okay, that's the part of unemployment benefits, other kinds of social security benefits, health, and so on. This was reformed in July 1992, split by firm size, and the tax rates were changed. This was such a successful reform, it lasted 6 months before we re-reformed it. Again became all firm sizes, now starting age 50, and then was reformed again in 1999, and this is the guy we're interested in. This reform here, this is my pre, this is my post. And I'm interested in this because the pre had the same tax for all firm sizes. The post differentiated by firm size, and in particular with a large rise in the tax for larger firms. On the contrary, no change in the tax for smaller firms. So essentially what's going to happen here, well, old people we don't care about, but imagine it's very nice that this room splits these layers. It really makes my job easy. So you are in, some of you are in a small firm, some of you are in a big firm. None of you are qualified to tax. Those of you who are in a big firm, your firm wants to lay some workers off. What's it going to do? It's going to lay you off. Because you're relatively cheap compared to the oldies. In the smaller firm, that's also going to happen, but less so. So here's my inference about insecurity. Insecurity rose for young workers in big firms more than it did for young workers in small firms, via the tax on the old people. That's the way we understand this, the effect of this reform on insecurity on the labour market. And this is the summary of the way in which we're analysing this. Just to say this actually worked. If you were a young worker in a big firm post-reform, you report more job insecurity and you're more likely to lose your job. So this actually has a reality, a as well. I don't need to measure this, I can just do a reduced form. But this is, in terms of mechanisms, this is what it looks like. Okay. So I'm an applied economist, and I have to have an equation in every presentation. It's a contractual obligation. So here is my equation. It looks very fancy, of course it's not. It's the difference in difference. I've got a treatment group, I've got a control group, that's the control obviously. And then I've got a pre-period, which is 1997 and before, and then a post-period that in this first equation I'm going to split into two. Why so? Because the reform was announced 1 year before it was implemented. So knowing that we're going to be exposed may introduce insecurity in the same way as being exposed. So just to underline the nature of what we do here, none of the layoffs have occurred in this analysis. These are all people who are in work. So that's why this is forward-looking. There's a risk of future layoff, but it hasn't happened yet. So that's the cute way in which we can get insecurity without relying on actual events that have happened in the past. Okay, but you get the idea. Young workers in big firms became more insecure. We're going to use panel data set. We don't need to use panel data set, but we would prefer to follow the same people over time, because we don't want to have selection out of treatment. You know that you're going to be at risk of job loss, so you leave your big firm and go and work in a small one. I can actually see that in panel data. If I use cross-sections, I can't. And I've got a problem of potential bias through selection into treatment. This is the satisfaction variable, again, I don't need, and other control variables that we don't really need to worry about. In the first instance, we're looking at what you might think of as a natural consequence of becoming insecure, having a child. Are you going to have a kid when you feel insecure? Well, your guess is no, because this is a long-term kind of, if I can put it this way, it's a bit of an illiquid asset. You don't want to buy a liquid asset, you want a kid. In our sample, these are French private sector workers, aged 16 to 49, I think. Oh, it's 20 to 49, sorry. Around 6.5% of those individuals had a child in the previous 12 months. This is going to be our outcome variable. And this is the effect of the reform on perceived job security. And the effect on perceived job security is around minus 0.15, minus 0.2. That doesn't make much sense to you, because why would it? But just to notice, this is on a 1 to 6 scale, standard deviation of just over 1. So we're talking about an effect of this reform, again, which didn't, we're not looking at people who lost their jobs, we're looking at people who might lose their jobs. The effect on this exposed group, that's young workers in large firms, is around a bit under 10% of the standard deviation, which is quite a large effect in terms of just the pure anticipation effect. Anyway, we don't care about that too much. This is the one we do care about, which is the effect on fertility. You can become insecure. Do you have fewer kids? Yes. The effect size here, if I look at the total effect of the reforms, that's all announcement plus implementation periods, just a little bit easier to read, is about minus 0.04. And again, you might not be very excited about that, because what the hell does that mean? What that means is you cut this fertility rate in half due to insecurity. And that is arguably a large effect. And indeed, as one of our referees said, that effect is too big to be true. this is too little to be of interest. So there's obviously some there's some golden effect size that pleases referees. This is a large effect on fertility. It is due to exogenous variation. It's panel data. It's arguably clean inference. We subject this to all kinds of specification tests. This seems to be one of the responses to insecurity. You stop having this. Okay, this is with the robustness, heterogeneity. So that's one outcome. Another outcome, again, on the sort of marriage and fertility side, is you might decide to get married. Why do people decide to get married? Well, of course, we're all economists, so we know lots of nothing to do with it. It's all to do with risk sharing. This is what we're about. So if you're in a couple, you share risk. It's an insurance contract. So we would expect people to get married more when they're exposed to risk, and this is actually what we find. This is the married Ugly Hills. The married in panel B. Again, this is panel data. I'm following the same people, pre, post, treated control. What's the difference between the two? I find that this is not very well done, this slide. The total effect of the reform is to increase marriage for women, not for men, which is hard. Look at this. Why does that come about? Well, it comes about for insurance reasons. I'm going through this quickly, because otherwise I'm boring to death with robustness tests, which, if you're interested in that, I can do it, right? But I don't think I should. We think this is insurance for the following reason. We know with whom these women get married. So if you're exposed to risk, then you want to insure yourself. Who should you match with? You should match with someone who is not exposed to risk. That's someone who naturally matches, so the risk pool. Okay? And that's what we find. The entreated women, if I can put it that way, do not get married to people who are unemployed, men who are unemployed. They do not get married to men who were affected by the Lugar tax rise. They do get married to people, to men who are in the control group, the untreated. So as if marriage was risk pooling. Okay, that's enough about marriage and family. Let's think about another large-scale decision that involves liquid assets, buying a house. We, again, had information on this in the same panel data set. We know whether people bought a house in the past 12 months. This is not house to house. It's not ownership to ownership. This is renter to ownership. Same idea. You're exposed to insecurity. Do you buy a large illiquid asset? Arguably, you would not do so. And that's indeed what we find in the data. That there is a fall of 1.5 to 2 percentage points in the probability of having switched from renting to owning in the past 12 months. And that's around 1/2 of the average home accession rate pre-reform. So again, it's a large effect. Okay, let me finish up by, these are big things, right? You have a kid. You get married, you buy a house. Probably none of us have done that in the last work. These are relatively rare events. We want also to think about the kind of things we do every single day. How does this affect our day-to-day life? And one of the things we do in day-to-day life is we consume. When we save. These are the decisions that are made as a function of resources, as a function of the returns to saving, and as a function of what we might think of as the need for saving, precautionary savings, or the object of savings. Huge literature on precautionary savings. nobody knows really how to define precautionary savings, and we certainly don't know how to define risk. So there's a lot of stuff out there that is not necessarily comparable. And in particular, it's mostly correlation. So the problem of omitted variables, how do I interpret this correlation between these two things? What I'd like again is an exogenous change that makes one side of the room more exposed to risk and the other side of the room there's no effect, or there's no change in risk. Do you save more? And this side. Here we don't have savings available in French data, but we do have in Italian data, and as I said, the Italians absolutely love messing around with the labour market as well. And without going into all the details, we're going to look at a reform in 2012, called the Olivera reform, that broadly shifted power from the worker to the firm in cases of, what do you call it, disputed dismissal? What do you call it? Well, things of unjust dismissal. And because the power was shifted to the firm, workers became less secure, because it's actually easier to get rid of. Again, the nature of the reform is one that's attractive because it's a treatment of a control group. And again, that treatment and control group is determined by firm size. The reform affected large firms. Here the definition of large is 15 or more employees. So I've got a difference in difference again. Pre-2012, post-2012, small firm, big firm, large firm employees became less secure. What did they do in terms of their saving and consumption? We have data from what's called SHIFT, the Survey of Household Income and Wealth in Italy. It's not incredibly, it's actually biannual. That's biannual. The difference between biannual and biannual is every 2 years. It's not biannual, it's twice a year. Actually, something I learned as an adult relatively recently, the difference between biannual and biennial, which changes all the time. It's repeated cross-section, so we do have an issue with selection into treatment. Anyway, you've got the idea by now. Difference in difference. Huh?
We use the panel. There is a panel.
Really?
Yes.
What did I say?
No, we didn't use the panel.
Should. This paper hasn't been published. It's kind of important to figure this out.
It is so important for that, this panel.
There's no panel. There's no panel.
So we use the
There's no individual question. Okay, we need to look at that. Okay. But anyway, the idea of difference in difference, household savings you get right. Our effect size, this is expressed in terms of standard deviations, just to make it simple. Our effect size are that this Olivera reform reduced savings in the, increased savings in the treated group by about 0.1 standard deviation, reduced consumption in the treated group by about 0.1 standard deviation. These things add up because there's no effect on income. So as you remember from Macroeconomics 101, week 1, income equals consumption plus savings. And that's what we find here. These are arguably relatively large effects. So just the effect of being subject to the Seminario reform gets you about 55 euros equivalent more per month. Equivalent is adjusted for household size. So for the average household size, we did this calculation, it's a little bit more than 100 euros, I think. So this is quite a lot of money. And people are saving, and in some sense there's no other way of interpreting this. People are saving more because they're more exposed to risk. And there's no individual risk effect. They can't be just controlling the gender. Okay, this is repeated cross-section. So I'm almost done. Let me just finish on this bit by saying I was very excited by this regression table. I'm not sure you're as excited as I was. I'm very easily excited. Because one thing we like to do in the world is understand risk aversion. We can try to measure this in the lab or via survey questions, but I think in general we don't have a good idea of what coefficient risk aversion is. And that's pretty essential to making decisions faced with risk and uncertainty. We need to know what that number is. And I thought we could actually estimate it from here. I've got an increased exogenous exposure to risk. I've got an observable change in savings. That should give me risk aversion, I thought. I thought that for not very long, actually. Because what I need to know is the size of the loss. If I know the size of the loss, I can calculate risk aversion. If I know risk aversion, I can calculate the size of the expected loss. Unfortunately, I've got one equation with two unknowns. So I'm going to have to calibrate one bit of this to try to calculate the other. But I think we can make progress. We did do it. We did do it. We did do it. We got this moment. And it wasn't true. It wasn't true. But that's a lot of things I think we can do. So, to conclude, I think we do have interesting information here coming from exogenous reports on responses to increase in risk that have large behavioural consequences. Two last lines before I stop is that this literature is extremely irritating, because I can say a great deal about private sector workers aged under 50 in 1999 in France. That's not our central area of interest. We want to know about general things, how do people react in general. And we don't know because we need to have exogenous changes in order to get this straight. So, obviously there's a need for more data, but there's also a need for more identification strategies that will allow us to make these kinds of statements. The very last thing is that we've tried to explain to you that insecurity matters, that it has political outcomes, that it has effects on fertility, marriage, savings behaviour. So can we explain rising rapid voting by our increased insecurity? Can we explain what we're talking about? Is the drop in fertility is absolutely staggering. Is that due to increased insecurity? And our evidence here is actually a little more mixed than you might think. This is only up to the mid-2010s, but in terms of a trend in job insecurity, there's no evidence here that job insecurity is on the rise across OECD countries, waiting for the most recent wave. If I look at satisfaction with job security in Australia, after the Great Recession, that's been on the rise. So no evidence of increasing insecurity after COVID. In Germany, we have concerns about job security. The grey line is not at all concerned. That's been rising with a bit of a blip in the Great Recession. That's been rising pretty much over the last 20 years. And even outside of the labour market, taking numbers from across Europe survey called EU-SILP, which is a harmonised survey across all the EU countries. Across all the EU countries, notice the UK seems to stop there in 2018. We stopped being European. If you look at this trend across major economies in Europe, there's actually not very strong evidence of a rise in insecurity. So if there has been a secular rise in insecurity over the last 20 years, we must be looking in the wrong places for it, because I'm just not seeing it in this data. But that's the kind of work we need to be doing, is actually understanding whether insecurity is on the rise, therefore can it explain